Thank you, Zomo, for the introduction on the first stage of the value chain in the oil and gas. I just want to take a little bit of time. I don't know how familiar you are with all that jargon about what is scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, what is greenhouse gases, what is CO2 equivalent, etc., etc. I'm sure you're all very proficient on these topics, but still, I mean, we have CO2, we talk about CO2 all the time. And by the way, sustainability is not only energy transition, right? Sustainability is a lot wider than energy transition. We're talking about social areas as well, right? We have to keep that in mind. Nevertheless, we only have a couple of hours today, so we're going to focus on energy transition. Energy transition, CO2 emissions. We talk about CO2 emissions because CO2 is the gas that is everywhere, that is very delocalized, that is emitted from a lot of different sources. Nevertheless, it's not the only greenhouse gas, right? We have a lot of other ones. We have methane, the famous methanes that a lot of people are talking about today, including in Glasgow, which is very good news, which is a more potent gas than CO2. So methane in the atmosphere warms the atmosphere faster than CO2, but it has a shorter life in the atmosphere. You also have N2O, you have HFCs, PFCs, SF6. Those are greenhouse gases as well. The good news is that the emissions are more centralized. So, and we have been able to tackle the emissions of those gases as well. But they're there. So when we talk about CO2 equivalent, we take into account all those gases as well. So there's a real difference between CO2 emissions and CO2 equivalent emissions. Then we have the different scopes. I'm sure you have heard of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. What the hell are those scopes? Basically, you have scope 1. When people talk about their emission, they're talking about the direct emissions from the assets, from the equipment they own, they control, financially, operationally. So when Zomo was talking about the emissions from their platforms, it's the emission scope 1 that is coming from the extraction and production of oil on the platform. Then you have scope 2 emissions that is related to the utilities you use in your activities, right? So electricity, but also heat. Obviously, when you use electricity that comes from renewable energies, your scope 2 emissions are 0. If you use electricity that is produced from a coal-fired power plant, then that's another story, right? So scope 2 emissions exist, and we can reduce the emissions, but they are related to utilities. And then you have scope 3 emissions, and scope 3 emissions is all the rest. So you have the suppliers, and then you have what's happening downstream your activities. And this is where difficult things happen. Basically, as a trader, we all scope 3. So here you go, what can you change, how can you make a difference, etc. We need to work on those scope 3 emissions. That was a little refresher. What does the split of emissions look like in the oil and gas, right? So when you look at oil, basically, what you have upstream, production, extraction is 25%, 24, 25% of your emissions, right? Then you have everything related to shipping, transportation. This is 1%. And then you have downstream, when we use those products, right? Everywhere, people's behavior, how they use their cars, how we fly, how we do all those things individually. And this is a very, very big chunk. And this is very difficult because it's all over the place. When you look at LNG, it's very similar, slightly different in terms of absolute emissions, but in terms of proportions, it's the same. The extraction, the production is 25-ish%, 3% on shipping, and then it's how we use those. So this is really the challenge we have, right? We have companies that are able to control their scope 1 emissions the way Lundin is doing it, the way we're working on refineries. But then there's the usage of all those fossil fuel-based products. And this is where we're facing a huge challenge. Coming to my subject now, basically, what is the role of refineries in the future energy landscape? So basically, if you take this map that is that has been defined by the International Energy Agency. This is the picture today. So basically you have this big arrow coming down, coal, natural gas, oil. As a refinery, we sit there. We sit at the bottom of that arrow. We have a lot of work to do on producing those products that are going to be used all over the chain. It's very central role. Sending products to industries for transport, buildings and others, right? This is changing. Obviously, when you look at, again, the net zero scenarios from the International Energy Agency, we can disagree on that scenario. It's one scenario, it's one picture. Let's use that as a base, you know, so that we can actually have an idea of what it's going to look like in 2050. You see those arrows, right? They are getting smaller, a lot smaller. So for refineries, how do you stay relevant in this market? How do you stay relevant in the energy industry? How do you still exist? You have heavy assets. You have a lot of workers, blue collars. You have a lot of know-how, but then your products are the ones that are emitting a lot of CO2 emissions when they are used by individuals, by companies. What do? Obviously, refineries are going to stay there, and they're going to stay there for activities that cannot be electrified. So basically, when we talk about decarbonization, the big thing we're talking about, the easy bit, is electrification, right? We electrify while we can electrify, and we produce that electricity with renewable energy, carbon neutral energy, etc., etc. But then there's everything that cannot be electrified that easily, right? As a refinery, obviously, you work on your Scope 1 emissions. You work on your Scope 1 emissions. What are the emissions from your operations? What are you emitting when you use your FCC? What are you emitting when you use your reformer? This, you can actually optimize your processes. You can optimize your energy use. You can do a lot of things, but this is tweaking, really. You're not going to get to zero that way. What you can do is also capture the carbon that you emit, because some of the processes in the refinery intrinsically is going to emit CO2, because what it does really is cutting carbon chains to create other carbon chains. And some of the carbons are just aligned with oxygen that is in the air, and it creates CO2. So what you do, you capture this. What you do with the CO2 afterwards is another matter, but still, you can capture it and you can store it. What you're going to do as well as a refiner, you're going to try and help industries, like petrochemical industries, reduce their CO2 footprint. So you're going to crack naphtha from recycled plastic, for example. You're going to help them reduce their CO2 emissions. For refineries, it is also crucial to get into bioenergy. So the processes that are existing in refineries can be transformed, can be leveraged to actually produce bioenergy, biofuels, biodiesels. You have a feedstock issue when you talk about biofuels, right? But more and more, we're talking about waste, we're talking about reusing things that would not actually take from other industries. And it's working better and better. And so modern bioenergy is definitely something that refineries are looking into. And then there is the famous hydrogen, right? Hydrogen, everybody's talking about hydrogen. It is going to be carrying renewable electricity everywhere, basically. And hydrogen is in all future scenarios, right? We use hydrogen everywhere when we look at scenarios by 2050. refineries have been producing and using hydrogen for a very, very long time. The problem is that this hydrogen comes from fossil fuel, it comes from methane, right? And what we could do is produce that hydrogen from fossil fuel, capturing the CO2 that we actually create when we fabricate that hydrogen. That is the famous blue hydrogen. So refineries are working onto, okay, how do I continue using my processes to continue fabricating hydrogen in the new way? Carbon capture, that's one possibility. You're gonna use, if you look into synthetic fuels, you're also using hydrogen when you look about, when you create synthetic fuels. So this is also another area where refineries will be using their know-how. And then again, there is, where is this renewable electricity going to be produced? Where are going to be all those solar panels? Where are going to be all those massive assets where we produce renewable electricity? Some will be nearby, but some are going to be far away. One thing refineries are looking into as well is to actually transport that hydrogen. Transport that hydrogen in different forms, right? You can create ammonia, you use it on ships, or we hope we'll be able to use it on ships. But you can also use different aromatics, right, to carry that hydrogen and bring it back to economies that need them in Europe, typically. You get, I don't know, electricity, renewable electricity produced in Saudi Arabia. You actually ship it in the form of toluene to Europe in a refinery. And in that refinery, you change that toluene back into hydrogen that can be used locally. So those are things that refineries are looking into. It is very difficult today for the industry to remain relevant, right? Because the assets are huge. It needs a very big amount of investment. It needs a very big amount of training. And it's a huge challenge for the whole industry in Europe, but also elsewhere, to continue being part of the new landscape. Nevertheless, there are some options, there are some technologies coming in, and yeah, let's hope that we will be able to leverage all that know-how, leverage all those assets that have brought value before into the new technologies of the future.